So let's see what we got here. So, alright. 2 fetch lands, 2 Death Shadows, couple Battle Ragers, and a Goyf. I am going to keep this, but we want actually more ways to lose life because we can't immediately cast these Death Shadows. So this hand is not ideal by any means. Now, if we had something like a Street Wraith or a discard spell, something like that, it would be a lot better. We do have 2 copies of the namesake card in the deck, being the Death Shadows, but as of right now, unclear that we're going to be able to get them into play in the first couple of turns. So it looks like we're up against an Elf deck. And I'm just going to take a draw step here. And now we can crack both fetch lands, which we definitely want to do. And that's going to put us down to 14. So one more fetch land would be really nice, just to be able to deploy. Just getting the Death Shadows into play is really important. We also need to try to grow this Tarmogoyf because it's really insignificant right now. So hopefully our deck cooperates, but it looks like our opponent has a very good draw this game. So Llanowar Elves on 1, now Elvish Mystic and Heritage Druid, make a bunch of green mana, play an Arch Druid. So this is pretty much as good as the Elves deck can, pretty much as strong as the Elves deck can start. So we drew a Street Wraith. Now one thing we could do is try to trick our opponent and attack the Goyf into the Arch Druid. See if our opponent blocks for some reason. Now I seriously doubt our opponent would block though, so I'm just going to cycle the Street Wraith. And we found a land. So, alright, now it is time to send in this Tarmogoyf. So we have the choice now of going Tarmogoyf plus Death Shadow, or just going Death Shadow, Death Shadow. And I think we want to go Death Shadow, Death Shadow. Even though they're just 1/1s at the moment, they can really grow pretty fast. And we've got 2 copies of Temur Battle Rage to potentially try to win our next turn, depending on how this plays out. So say our opponent attacks us with everything, or attacks us with some number of elves. We can then take the damage from those elves and use it to our advantage. So our opponent doesn't actually necessarily have great attacks. But this is going to be a bunch of mana off the Archdruid, so this could be a big payoff card, and it's a collected company. So now the question is, what can our opponent find here? And it is an Azuri Renegade Leader coming off the top, or coming off that collected company rather. So now that's pretty much exactly what the doctor ordered for our opponent. Our opponent can activate that Azuri this turn if they would like to do so, or can wait to... So what they could do in order to activate it this turn is to tap these 3 elves and then immediately activate the Azuri. So it looks like that is what's going to happen. So now there's 3 5/5s coming across the table, and there's not really any good plays from our perspective. So we can fetch. So say we crack the fetch land, right? We can make our Death Shadows bigger, which makes them better blockers, but now all of a sudden we're at 9, so we have to go chump chump. And if we do go chump chump, we can't really conceivably win on our next turn, but we don't actually have a choice. We have to go chump block, chump block. And yeah, this is gonna do it for the game. Both of our Death Shadows are gonna die on this attack. So looking at the sideboard against Elves, Liliana, the Last Hope, seems quite good because there's a bunch of 1/1s. So like Llanowar Elves or Heritage Druid or whatever, the Liliana, the Last Hope, can just eat it. There's not that many cards we necessarily need to take out in this matchup. Now, another card we probably do want to bring in is the Grafdigger's Cage, because Grafdigger's Cage stops cards like Collected Company and Court of Calling. So we definitely want those. The Collective Brutalities seem fine, not amazing. I can see shaving some of the discard. So, like, Inquisition seems cuttable. I think we'd rather have Brutality than Inquisition in this matchup. Colligan's Command, it's a kind of an expensive shock. I think we would rather have some discard than the Colligan's Command, just like 1 mana versus a 3 mana discard spell. So let's go with this. And we are on the play again, having lost that game. Now this is a clear mulligan. 4 lands, double traverse. Inquisition, definitely not going to cut it. But 6-card hand is serviceable for sure. So I'm going to keep this. We'll see what we scry into. We probably are going to want to fetch. So yeah, Pizzamishra's Bobble on top. And I don't think that card is good enough to warrant choosing not to fetch on turn 1 to draw it for our next draw step. So I'm going to fetch and get a Blood Crypt and lead off on Thoughtseize. So we see Dwinnen's Elite, Elvish Visionary, and Eternal Witness. I'm going to grab the Witness because it gets back the other 2 cards. And we also have Thoughtseize to be able to disrupt our opponent. And that was a great draw, the Death Shadow there. So because our opponent doesn't have another elf, I'm going to take the Visionary. So our opponent can't play Dwinnen's Elite this turn, make a creature. So this is where we just kind of press our advantage, play a 3/3 Death Shadow. Now we only have 2 cards in hand, but a lot of our draws are going to be great. There's a Heritage Druid. So if we draw a land, we can play Liliana. No land, so that's a little bit unfortunate. So I'm just gonna attack. If our opponent plays the Dwinnen's Elite, we can just get rid of the Heritage Druid in response. So, yep, I'm going to do that, and that's going to stop our opponent from being able to make that additional elf from this Dwinnen's Elite. And here's a Collective Brutality. So I think we want to just use this as a removal spell here. Just to get the Dwinnen's Elite off the battlefield. We definitely don't want to gain life off of the Collective Brutality. So that's something you do have to be aware of. And, yep, just going to continue getting in there. we'll see. I mean, there's some small chance our opponent drew a collected company in those couple turns, but looks like that didn't happen. And so even though we didn't draw the third land, which we would have been like our best draw in those past few turns, we've still been perfectly fine. Drawing another Death Shadow helps us put more pressure onto the board. And yeah, any fetch land means we would lose 3 life. And yeah, our opponent's just going to concede this one. So that's going to force another game here. And on the draw, we may just want to go up to the full amount of Inquisitions and take out some of the Liliana, the Veils, which would have been fine in those games. In that game, had we played it on curve on 3, but the discard spells were also really important as well. And I think we just want to try to disrupt our opponent. We need our opponent not to have that sort of a nut draw. Essentially, Elf into Dwinen's Elite type thing that we saw as a potential possibility earlier. I'm going to keep this one because it has a lot of good cards in the matchup. We definitely want to draw another land, but if we don't immediately draw it, we can still potentially do some things. And there's a Grafdigger's Cage. We'll see if our opponent has anything we want to use that Grafdigger's Cage on. So I'm going to start on the Inquisition. And this will help us sort of see what's going on. And so, absolutely, our opponent has cards that we would like to Grafdigger's Cage, as we see multiple collected companies in hand for our opponent. And so this is pretty interesting in terms of, do we take Azuri here, or do we take Scavenging Ooze? Because Azuri, it's not actually doing that much. So I think we take the Ooze because it's the card our opponent can immediately cast no matter what. Although there's a land, so now our opponent could play Azuri. Okay, sure. And Street Race, so we get to draw a card here. And Mishra's Bauble, that's going to allow for another draw. We can also see what's going on our opponent's side of the board. And there's a Windswept Heath, so that means that our opponent is going to draw the 4th land. So we need to play the Grafdigger's Cage this turn to shut off the collecting company. If our opponent hadn't had the 4th land on top, we wouldn't have necessarily needed to play the cage this turn. So this game is a little bit weird, just because we still haven't found that land, which we definitely need. And there's a Goyf, so I am just going to pass the turn. But the only good thing about this is that we don't really mind losing life because of the Death Shadow. There's a Nettle Sentinel. It looks like our opponent's just going to keep mana up and pass the turn. Here's an Inquisition of Kozilek. That's not what we wanted to see. And it looks like our opponent is wary of the Death Shadow here. But we're not out of it, so even though our opponent can potentially activate the Azuri, we have these Fatal Pushes, which we can set up, if we draw another land, that's best case scenario, but our opponent's respecting the Death Shadow, and it's also respecting, keeping up mana to be able to activate Nykthos and pump the squad with Azuri. So I'm just going to go to discard again. This time discarding a Goyf. So we got these two fatal pushes. If we draw a fetch land, it would be great. But maybe our opponent will actually go for the Azuri activation here. Now, if that's the case, we can still Tarfire away the Azuri. Looks like instead it's going to be an Elvish Archdruid. So, in response to this Elvish Archdruid, we can go ahead and Tarfire the Azuri. And so that's going to keep us in this game. We've got these fatal pushes for the smaller elves. We know that our opponent has 2 companies stranded in hand, and I understand why our opponent's not pressuring us, but just because of these types of cards, our opponent's trying to play around everything. So that's going to be 2 regeneration shields on the Sentinel and the Llanowar Elves, but it's not that relevant here. So once again, I like just passing. If our opponent does decide to attack, we can finally fall below 13, and I know our opponent's clearly aware of this, what the situation is, which is if our opponent attacks, it's going to allow us to play the Death Shadow. We can also, regardless, we can fatal push something this turn. So I'm going to fatal push the biggest creature our opponent has, which is the Nettle Sentinel, and then take 4 down to 9. This is going to allow us to play Death Shadow, though. Finally play Death Shadow. So even though we didn't draw the land, we can still play the Death Shadow as a 4/4, which is right now the biggest creature on the board, and it's going to force our opponent to do something about this, essentially. And it looks like our opponent does not have something immediately. There's another Death Shadow, so we can actually now send this Death Shadow in for an attack. That's going to drop our opponent down to 14. We can play another one. And this is a pretty absurd game. By the way, we could have thought seized ourselves earlier, or our opponent, but I was fine with our opponent not attacking us, but once our opponent finally did, it's the perfect opening to get these Death Shadows into play. And now the board's gumming up. We see a bunch of elves from our opponent. We still need to draw the second land, kind of. Second land would be huge. Unfortunately, it's just a Mishra's Bauble. So one play that we do have access to in this spot is to sack the Mishra's Bauble and still be able to fatal push away the Archdruid. So I am going to attack in with both Death Shadows. And we'll see how our opponent exactly wants to block here. So the Elite and the Warrior are going to jump in front of a Death Shadow, and this is going to work out. So our opponent's got a Court of Calling on top. We can sack the Mishra's Bauble, Fatal Push the Archdruid. Now the Dwynen's Leaf and the Warrior are going to be smaller. Our opponent can cast a Collected Company if they want to. Not really going to do anything. Except it would mean that our opponent doesn't draw that Court of Calling for whatever that's worth. But it looks like our opponent's just going to draw the Court of Calling, which is not going to do anything here because of the Grafdigger's Cage. And it looks like we are actually going to win this game, most likely, with one land. Not having drawn the second land at all this entire game. So that's pretty unreasonable. Shouldn't really be happening, feels like. Our opponent may have misstepped, unclear for sure. But I'm going to cycle the Street Wraith, make our Death Shadows bigger. Still no second land. So, yep, just going to send them in. Our opponent's going to need to block at least one. Looks like it's just going to be chump chump. So now our opponent needs to find something this turn, or else this is the game. These two Death Shadows have just gone the distance. That's it. And we see our opponent reveal a hand of Collected Company, Chord, Forest.